2019, and Dr. Hayes, who will be introduced by the person that Sharon will introduce, is helping us to question that. So if you were here on Friday night, you would have seen a Shabbat service, Shabbat Kulani, that is different than any other Shabbat you might have experienced here, which we start to do every first Friday of the month. It's an intergenerational service, and we had 110 people come. People who have kids that are small, that don't know where they are, that don't have access to Shabbos. Don't have access to Judaism. So part of what we're doing here in the synagogue, and we're so glad to have our speaker to help us to structure those pieces, is how to address this issue. How can we create as many doors as we can to foster an engaging and relevant Judaism? Questioning what we've done, but willing to be brave enough to partner together to... All right? I did not see you there. That was coffee next time before, okay? That we can address these questions and continue to be a relevant source of progressive, independent, and vibrant Judaism in Bergen County. So Sharon, coming over. Yay!
Thank you.
We have Marcus going to look at you.
We're already a great team. So I've had a delightful hour or so talking to our speaker, and then I looked up and the room was filled, and it is just such a rewarding, this is our 12th year here, and it's just so rewarding to look up and see that you keep on coming back. You know, we work as hard as we can to give you the best speakers and topics that will keep on engaging us. So really thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. And just a couple of shout outs. First to Rabbi Emmerich. Word is that he was roaming the halls here and found himself in Reb Benny's office this week. But in fact, Rabbi Emmerich heard Dr. Hayes speak at the Hartman Institute, and we've been trying to get her for 2 years. Last year we couldn't find the time, and so it's really exciting. Here we are, and everything is kind of shared. This is the perfect time for her to be here, so it all worked out. So shout out to Rabbi Emmerich, and also Rabbi Ziona Zalazo studied with Christina Hayes, and she encouraged us to come and bring her here. A couple of more quick shout outs. We now have a hearing assist program, so we've got some attendees here who have struggled and wanted to be a part of this program and were not able to. So a shout out to Martin Uterman, who's worked for us is with full heart, and we've got this hearing assist program, so we really appreciate that as well. David Edelson is on camera. We've come a long way with our IT stuff. We've got a great committee, and our high holiday live streaming was terrific, and now we're recording our guest speakers, so shout out to him and our whole team as well. You've heard me say this before, without those patrons' names back here, we can't reach out to people like Christina Hayes, so thank you so much for continuing to support us with your funds and also with your presence and the fact that you bring people to hear us speak. Our committee, I love these people. This is one of my favorite places to be, is working with a team of people. Everybody knows their places, what they need to do. Everything runs smoothly. Karen, who's still walking around, is in charge of the food piece and a lot of home cooking here. I want to thank everybody. So, okay, so David, Faith, who else? And Karen, and Karen's husband this time made the fruit platter. Anybody else, Karen? Who, all the kitchen helpers as well. And of course, Dennis. I mean, he knows the drill as well. He gets everything in order as well. So I really have to thank everybody before we proceed. It doesn't happen just by itself. So have a great learning experience today. Come and enjoy all the other learning experiences we have. Reb Benny started his Tish on Zionism. It's just a wonderful place to explore different information and conversation. We have our lunch and learn. We have our readers group. And if there's anything else you want to learn, we're here to continue the Jewish tradition of learning. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Sharon, who's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. It gives me great honor to introduce Dr. Christine Hayes, who's the Weiss Professor of Religious Studies and Classical Judaica at Yale. Dr. Hayes was, before her appointment at Yale, an assistant professor of Hebrew Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, and her background is a PhD in Talmudic and Judaic Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. There's a trifecta of higher education, but if so, she won it. Now, our speaker has published a number of books and articles in American and international academic journals. Her books include What's Divine About Divine Law, Early Perspectives, and here's another trifecta. She won the 2015 National Jewish Book Award in Scholarship, the 2016 Award for Theology and Religious Studies from the American Publishers Association, and the 2016 Jordan Schnitzer Award from the Association for Jewish Studies. Her previous book, Gentile Impurities and Jewish Identities, was a 2003 National Jewish Book Award finalist. She is also a senior research fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and she's president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Nothing surprising there. You know, we have had many wonderful speakers over the years, but this is the first time I can remember that every rabbi I spoke to about Dr. Hayes' coming said, "Oh, you had a wonderful experience in store." This included Rabbi Yard, Reb Benny, Rabbi Tziona, and Rabbi Peg. So, obviously, we have something really special in store for you today. Here is Dr. Christine Hayes.
Thank you so much, both Sharon and the rest of the Education Committee, and Benny as well. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be a part of the learning that your community is clearly so excited about. Jewish identity is complicated. I could actually finish today we're going to spend some time with classical sources, and by that I mean biblical sources, and then the rabbinic sources of the Talmudic period up till about the 7th century, in an effort to shed light on the complex nature of Jewish identity. And I want to flag something for you from the very outset. We're going to be thinking about Jewish identity from two angles, that of the individual and that of the community. We're going to ask what makes an individual Jewish and what makes a community Jewish. And we'll see that those two questions are interrelated, but they're not necessarily identical. So it's always good to start with the dictionary, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary has the following definitions. A Christian is a person who believes in the teachings of Jesus Christ. I was a Jewish Christ. Jesus Christ. A Muslim is a person whose religion is Islam. Okay, but a Jew is a person whose religion is Judaism, who is descended from Jewish people, or who participates in the culture surrounding Judaism, right? 3 times as long a definition as the others. But I think this definition tries to capture the complex phenomenon of Jews by birth, Jews by religious choice, Jews by cultural affiliation. There's more than one way for an individual to constitute him or herself as Jewish, and all of these different models of being Jewish get folded into what we call the Edah, or the Kahal Yisrael, or Edat Yisrael, the Jewish community. So we'll begin by exploring the complex nature of Jewish identity in biblical sources, where it's really Israelite identity, so you'll hear me say that instead, for the individual and for the community. And we're going to ask, what are the different ways that individuals could stake a claim to Israelite identity in biblical times? We're going to ask, what was the makeup of the Israelite community in biblical times? And then we're going to consider how a couple of moments of historical crisis in later times affected the conversation about Jewish identity into the rabbinic or Talmudic period. Okay, so that's a little layout of where we're going this morning. So the complex nature of ancient Israelite identity was made possible, I think, by the fact that at the moment of the people's formation, there's a fundamental openness about the nature of the nation that God wants to create with Abraham. You see this in the initial call to Abraham in Genesis 12. It's the first text on your handout, where God doesn't indicate the defining features or the substantive traits of the new nation, right? Genesis 12, verses 1 to 2, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation." God doesn't say, "I will make of you a nation of people who wear green hats, or who play a certain kind of music, or who believe in voodoo." He just says, "Abram, get up and go, because you and I are going to start something new, a new people." But there's no defining content ascribed to that nation in the initial moment of the call in Genesis 12. So how is that nation, that people, defined? Through biological kinship? Well, not quite. Seed is clearly very important. Numerous offspring are promised to Abram, and of course descent will play a large role in determining individual Israelite identity. And yet descent is not a necessary condition for Israelite identity, even biblically. Almost from the outset, biologically related persons take on, biologically unrelated persons take on Israelite identity. Abraham, the text says, will acquire souls or persons in Haran to join his community. Moses marries foreign wives. His first, Zipporah, a Midianite. His second, a Cushite woman, and yet produces fully Israelite children with these women. A mixed multitude, an Erev Rav, will come out of Egypt with the Israelites. In the time of the monarchy, foreign women give birth to kings over Israel, with no one apparently questioning the king's Israelite credentials. So biological kinship doesn't appear to be a necessary condition of Israelite identity, nor is it a sufficient condition for Israelite identity, meaning it's not true that if you have it, you're automatically in. And this can surprise people. But in Genesis 17, verse 4, God tells Abraham that he will become the father of many nations, not just one nation, the Israelite nation, but many. In fact, he has two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and Ishmael will become the father of a distinct nation. His other son, Isaac, will also have two sons, and one of them, Esau, or Edom, will become the father of a distinct nation, the Edomites. So, from the very outset, there is movement in by non-biologically related persons, and there's movement out by biologically related persons. So this nation that God wants to form is not, strictly speaking, a kinship group defined by biological ties. So is the nation defined in religious terms? Well, not at this initial stage. When God calls Abraham, he doesn't set a religious requirement. He doesn't say, "Give up your gods and go and worship me in this way at this place." He just says, "Leave home. You and I, we're going to start a new nation." The biblical text even tells us that Abraham and the other patriarchs continued to worship household idols. And the Israelites as a people will continue to worship Baal for centuries after entering the land of Israel. And as Jeremiah tells us, in the 6th century, they were still offering honey cakes to the Queen of Heaven, right down to the destruction of the first temple. The prophets don't like it, but the people were still Israelites, even as they worshipped other gods. So at the birth of the nation, the character of that nation's identity is open, undefined, perhaps intentionally so, I think. Because as the Bible will make plain, there is more than one way to stake a claim to Israelite or Jewish identity. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the biblical text offers us 3 different models of Jewish identity. I call them memory, covenant, and kedusha, or holiness. And each of these is a sufficient condition for staking a claim of Jewish identity, and none is presented as the one sole necessary condition. So we're going to consider first how memory functions to create the Jewish identity of individuals and communities, and how rituals of memory create group identity. The night before the Exodus from Egypt, in Exodus 12, God tells Moses to tell the Israelites to slaughter a lamb and to mark their homes with the blood, and to eat unleavened bread. And he then says, he takes the time out, as this is pretty, you think about it, it's a busy night, lots happening, the firstborn are being killed everywhere. But God stops in Exodus 12 to set out a very long chapter in which he says, and by the way, I want you to do this every year. The Israelites must perform these acts, eating unleavened bread and slaughtering a Passover lamb, each year as rituals of memory. In other words, God is saying this is so important. This experience of the redemption from slavery is to become a foundational and formative historical memory. It should shape your community's identity, and that memory should be invoked regularly through rituals of memorialization. So verses 14 to 19, I'm going to jump a little bit in these texts. We don't have time to read everything, but I'll point to where I'm reading. Verses 14 to 19 describe the first of the two rituals, the ritual of unleavened bread. So verse 14, this day shall be to you one of remembrance, the zikaron, and you should celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout your generations or throughout the ages, right? So it's an act of remembrance, a ritual of memorialization. Verse 17 tells us why. If you look at verse 17, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. It's to remember that redemption. What is the ritual? Verse 15 tells us, 7 days you shall eat matzah, unleavened bread. Whoever eats leavened bread, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So it's a collective memory, which means the entire collective is to participate in the invocation of this memory, even as we see in verse 19. So let's see who is included in this community that performs this ritual of collective memory. Verse 19, no leaven shall be found in your houses for 7 days. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from Edat Yisrael, from the community of Israel, whether he is a sojourner, a ger. A ger is, in biblical times, not a convert. A ger is a resident alien, sort of like a green card holder today. A foreigner who resides among you, okay, but quite explicitly a non-native. So, that person who eats leaven shall be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is a sojourner, a ger, or a citizen, an Israel of the country. You shall eat nothing leavened. So the ger may be a foreigner, but by participating in the collective memory, the ger becomes a member of Edat Yisrael, a member of the collective, the community of Israel, without in any way erasing his personal status as a non-citizen. So here we see already an important idea that what makes an individual Jewish and what makes a community Jewish are not necessarily the same thing. This text imagines non-Jews participating in the collective memory, the collective identity of the Jewish community, affiliating themselves through that personal choice. Or to put it another way, a community that creates its identity through rituals of memory and a collective narrative can have a Jewish identity, even when the community contains individuals who are not Jewish. A community can be pluralistic, in other words, without threatening its collective identity. Now, there's a second ritual described in Exodus 12 in the continuation of the chapter, and I love the fact that these two are side by side because it works differently from the first one. In verses 21 to 25, Moses tells the Israelites to slaughter lambs to mark their homes and to do so each year thereafter. We're going to pick it up at verses 26 and 27. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians but saved our houses. So again, it's a ritual memorializing a formative event for the community. And who partakes of this community forming ritual? Verses 45 to 49 tell us. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover offering. No foreigner, the word here now is nochri. This is not a resident alien. This is a foreigner who lives in another place, right? So no foreigner, no nochri shall eat of it. But any slave, now it's non-Jewish, that a man has brought may eat of it once he has been circumcised.
Who's checking?
That's interesting. Who's checking? I imagine the owner of the house would have performed the ritual, to tell you the truth, actually, in antiquity, so they would have. No bound or hired labor, toshav v'sachir, shall eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, etc. Verse 47. The whole community of Israel, we have that phrase again called Edat Yisrael, or Adat Yisrael, shall offer it. If a sojourner, a ger, who dwells with you, would offer the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised. Then he shall be admitted to offer it. Still a ger, still a resident alien. He shall then be like a citizen of the country, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. There shall be one law for the citizen, the Ezrach, and for the sojourner, the ger who dwells among you. Now this is kind of interesting to get your head around this. There's a different requirement for inclusion in this ritual, and that requirement is circumcision. And that requirement doesn't map onto biological kinship. A foreigner who lives completely outside the community, a nochri, is excluded. But one who lives as a slave in the household, as long as they're circumcised, is included. They're a member of the household. A ger, a resident alien, is included if circumcised. A citizen is included if circumcised, but a citizen or native-born Israelite would be excluded if not circumcised. And those who participate are called the whole community, Kol Adat Yisrael, the whole community of Israel. And that includes, therefore, a circumcised ger. He's still a ger, of course, an alien. And yet, through participating in the Passover ritual, he's a member of Adat Yisrael, this community of Israel. So Exodus 12 gives us many different identities and many different ways of affiliating and participating. You have the Ben Nachar, the Nochri, the foreigner, who's outside the community and its memories. So there's a boundary. There's still a bounded community. There's the uncircumcised ger, the alien. They become a part of the community of Israel through participating in the matzah ceremony, the matzah ritual that we talked about first, that memorializes the redemption from Egypt. The circumcised ger can participate even more fully and in full equality with the citizen through the Passover ritual that memorializes God's sparing of the Israelite firstborn. And then there's the circumcised native-born, who's included as a citizen, but the uncircumcised native-born who's excluded from the second Passover ritual, but presumably included in the first. So the takeaway, I think, from Exodus 12 is that community boundaries can be drawn in such a way as to contain individuals with very different personal identities and statuses and relationships to the memories and rituals of the collective. Again, a community defined by collective memory can be pluralistic. Let's look at one more source on the role of memory in creating a collective identity. This is Deuteronomy 26. You want to remember this text because it'll come back up later. This is a passage that describes a ritual that each Israelite is to say when they bring the first fruits of the harvest to the temple. They're supposed to bring a basket, present it to the priest, and then recite the following words from Deuteronomy 26. And when I read this, I want you to pay attention to the pronouns, and I've sort of, I think, highlighted them or bolded them, the pronouns in this passage as the Israelite is speaking and making the presentation. All right, and you shall make response before the Lord your God, and you shall say the following. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. And then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God, and worship before the Lord your God. And then you shall rejoice in all the good that the Lord your God has given to you, and to your house, you and the Levite and the sojourner who is among you. What I love about this passage is that the offerer starts off speaking of his father in the third person. These things happen to him, as if he's telling someone else's story. My father was this Aramean, he went down to Egypt, he became a nation there, and then slowly as the person is speaking, they start to enter into the story and start to make the narrative their own. And we were afflicted, and we cried out, and our toil, our labor, our oppression, and God brought us out. Slowly the person begins to see that these things perhaps happened to him too. The fact is, however, that the person was not personally afflicted. He didn't, in fact, experience personally the exodus from Egypt any more than he originally went down to Egypt, like the Aramean father. But the switch from the third person to the first person plural is a way of saying that even if you weren't there, every Jew must see themselves as if they were. And of course, the Passover Haggadah says that, right? Every Jew should see themselves as having experienced the Exodus from Egypt. But of course, no one in this room really did, right? But that's what collective memories are about. They are about our intentionally choosing to join a story and to be a part of a narrative. In other words, it's not just the non-native who has to actually actively take on a memory of the collective through a ritual of memory. In Deuteronomy, we learn that even the native-born have to actively read themselves into the national history, consciously choose to take on that collective memory, because none of it happened to them either. So my third takeaway point is that the memory of collectives is always, for the non-native born and for the native born, an act of imagination, a choice, an intentional choice that creates community belonging. That's why the rabbis describe the wicked child at Passover as the one who refuses to perform that act of imaginative entering into the history, right? The wicked child, according to the rabbis, is the one who says, "What are all these rituals for you? Not me, for you." He's saying, this is your memory and story, it's not mine. It's your responsibility and not mine. I say responsibility because that's the thing about memory. There's an ethical aspect to it. We don't hold people responsible for the things they don't remember doing, usually. To take ownership of a collective memory means to take responsibility for it and its consequences. So when someone intentionally takes on the collective memory of a people and enters into their story, they're taking on an ethical responsibility for the collective's past deeds, and they're agreeing to stand accountable for the collective's present and even future deeds. So reading ourselves into a collective memory and identity is not something that's done lightly. It's an ethical commitment. And we see this idea, I think, in the biblical exemplar of someone who took on the collective identity of the people, lived with them and lived like them, and took ethical responsibility by acting for the good of the community rather than herself necessarily, and its members, and that is, of course, Ruth. When her mother-in-law, Naomi, urges the widowed Ruth to return to her people, saying, "I can't provide for you, I can't even give you a husband, it's going to be a life of poverty," Ruth says in text 4, and I'll start at verse 16, Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Ruth chooses to join the story of Israel. And why? Because she loves Naomi. Because she loves one individual among the people and wants to help her carry out her obligation to continue her dead husband's line in Israel. And that's enough. That's enough for Ruth to say that she wants to adopt his people as her people. "I want to accompany you, Naomi, in your story. Where you go, I will go. Your people are my people, and that means I'll do what they do. I'll follow their God and his rules. I'll live where they live. I'll die where they die. And it means I'll take ethical responsibility for you as my mother-in-law, for my people, for the actions and destiny of this collective. And I'll act in ways that continue this people's story." And we know that she did, of course. She followed the rules and ended up restoring a lineage that would lead to King David. So when identity is constructed through collective memory, membership in the collective requires intention and choice, which means that the community's boundary is a porous boundary. It allows for the admission of new members who accept the community's memory, its narrative, its story about itself, past, present, and future, and take responsibility for that story. The second model of Jewish identity that we encounter in the Bible, and it's another sufficient condition for staking a claim to Jewish identity, is via the covenant. When God meets the Israelites at Sinai to enter into the covenant with them, he says, and this is text 5 from Exodus 19, he says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Ve'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. And these are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel, and then God lays out the commandments. So community identity here is forged through the covenant. Obey my covenant, that will make you my people. The Israelites are a people who have covenanted with their God and observe that God's rules. It's a religious mode of affiliation. Covenantal identity is aspirational. You will be my people if you observe my Torah. It's an identity or a status to be gained, and again, it requires intention and choice. The covenantal model establishes a boundary around the community that is, again, porous because it's based on choice. Covenantal status isn't automatically transmitted. Each generation has to learn and has to opt in again. That's why in the book of Deuteronomy, 40 years after Sinai, God asks again, are you still in? Let's renew this covenant and declare today that you will keep my commandments. That's text 6. We're not going to read it, but that's the idea. When God comes again 40 years later, are you still in? Are we going to confirm again? Ezra will also renew the covenant. Joshua renews the covenant before him, right? There are many covenant renewals. So this element of intention and choice is, of course, the basis for the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah ceremonies. That's what that's all about. It's the moment when each individual child technically is opting in. I will be bar mitzvah, a child of or someone subject to the mitzvah, the commandments, the covenant. So a community whose collective identity is grounded in covenant is a community in which membership requires teaching and learning, and it requires intentionality and choice because one must accept the obligations of the covenant for oneself. Who's eligible for this covenantal identity? In the covenantal renewal ceremony that's depicted in text 7, that's from Deuteronomy 29, we see that the assembled group includes the men, the women, the children, and the sojourner, the non-native in the camp. Once again, the identity of the community is determined differently from the identity of individuals. The covenantal community can include some non-Israelites, some resident aliens, and yet it is no less a covenantal Israelite community. Moreover, in verses 13 and 14 of that passage we read, "And it is not with you alone that I am making this sworn covenant, but with whoever is standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and with whoever is not here with us today." So just like the memory model for Jewish identity, on the covenant model, membership in the collective requires intention and choice, and the community boundary is porous. One doesn't even have to be biological kin or a member of the original group that stood at Sinai to enter the covenant. Future generations can as well. I want to turn now to our third and final model, which I called Kedusha, which means holiness. The Israelites are referred to several times in the Bible as an Am Kadosh, a holy people. What does that mean? The Hebrew root for Kadosh simply means separate or set apart to God, right? Separate from ordinary things or other nations and set apart to God. You keep something separate and set apart by observing certain rules towards it that you don't observe towards other things. How is the Sabbath's holiness preserved? By observing certain rules regarding it that we don't on other days, right? We don't work on the Sabbath. If you do, then you are doing what to the Sabbath? Profaning it, desacralizing it, right? Treating it like an ordinary work day. So to be kadosh simply means to be separated out from the ordinary, separated to God, and that separate status is preserved by observing certain sorts of rules. So in Exodus 19, which was text 5, remember that God said to the Israelites that if they observe the rules of the covenant, you will be to me, he says, separated to me, a goy there it's goy kadosh and an kadosh. But in Deuteronomy, we have a slightly different idea of holiness taking root. It's not a result of human action, a status that Israel attains by observing the rules of the covenant. Observe the rules of the covenant and that will make you a separate holy people. In Deuteronomy, we see the beginning of the idea that holiness is a result of God's action in choosing to separate Israel out from other nations. This is text 8, Deuteronomy 7. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And then it goes on to say, don't get a big head. It's not because you were so great. In fact, you're pretty small and insignificant, but God just loved you and fulfilled his promise to your forefathers, okay? So in Deuteronomy, holiness is a God-given status, and the commandments serve to preserve and mark that holiness or separation, particularly the laws that other nations don't observe. There's nothing particularly special about saying, well, Israel is holy because, they prohibit murder. Probably every society on earth prohibits murder. That doesn't really make them a separate and different nation. The laws that in particular are connected with Israel's separate status or its holiness to God are the ritual commandments, the dietary laws, the ritual impurity laws, and other unique observances, because other nations don't observe them. So in Leviticus 11, which is text 9, we have a list of prohibited foods, and at the end, in verses 44 and 45, we read, For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. Right? You should be separate from others, because I am distinct and separate. You shall not make yourselves unclean through any swarming thing that moves upon the earth by eating these things. For I, the Lord, am he who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And this exhortation to be holy, because I am holy, often accompanies the dietary laws or ritual impurity laws or other laws that are unique rituals for Israel. The language of kedusha, or holiness, or separation, is also used in connection with marriage behaviors. So we're going to look at Deuteronomy 7 again. Now this is the first part of Deuteronomy 7. This is text 10, regarding the prohibition of marriage with Canaanites. So after listing the 7 Canaanite nations that God says he will uproot from the land to make way for the Israelites, God then says in verse 3 and following, You shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. Why? For they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. And God will get angry and zap you. Okay. And then in verse 6, we see, For you are a people consecrated or holy, kadosh, to the Lord your God. You can't worship other gods, so don't intermarry with people who will turn you away to the worship of other gods. So God says marriage with Canaanites is prohibited because they will turn the Israelite partner to the worship of other gods. And that's not okay because you're a people holy to or separated to God, he says. Of course, I have to admit that this isn't actually a blanket prohibition. There's a clause in Deuteronomy that makes an exception for a beautiful captive Canaanite. Just point that out. This is obviously written by men. She can be permitted and assimilated into the community. So even this one, which seems so hard and fast, ain't so hard and fast. But the Pentateuch does not ban all intermarriages, just the Canaanites and 2 other groups, as we see in text 11. This is Deuteronomy 23. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation, the kahal of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. Why? Because they were mean to you, right? They didn't meet you with food and water on your journey. They hired Balaam to curse you, and so on. So verse 7 says, You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. But, verse 8, You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. And you shall not abhor an Egyptian, interestingly enough, right? Because you were actually a ger, a stranger in his land, before the enslavement. You were able to live with them. Children born to them may be admitted into the congregation of the Lord in the 3rd generation. Remember, this is being spoken just a generation after the escape from slavery. So give it a couple generations, it'll be fine. You can intermarry with Egyptians. So Ammonites and Moabites are not permitted entry into the kahal because they're enemies. But besides Canaanites, Ammonites, and Moabites, there's no universal permanent biblical ban on marriage with foreigners, which is why we see so much of it in the biblical text and the biblical story. There's a 2-generation ban on Egyptians and Edomites, but no ban at all on others. Phoenicians, Kenites, Rechabites, Midianites, Arameans, there are lots of other peoples in antiquity. So Israel's designation as a holy, distinct, or separate people is enacted by the observance of certain practices, especially dietary, purity, and marriage practices that mark them as distinct and separate, precisely because only they observe them and others don't. Like the memory model of identity and the covenant model of identity, on the kedusha model of identity, Membership requires intention and choice. You have to decide to observe these practices. And the community boundary is still porous. Native Israelites must choose to preserve their holy identity through the behaviors that mark them as distinct. But non-natives can also enter the holiness of the community by choosing to observe the practices that mark the community as sacred and separate. So there are three takeaways from this quick review of the biblical sources. Jewish identity in biblical times was multidimensional. Individuals could stake a claim to Jewish identity, Jewish affiliation, membership in the Eidah, by participating in the community's collective memory, which entails an ethical commitment to the community's present and future, by accepting the terms of the covenant, or by entering the kedusha, or separateness of the community, through practices and behaviors that mark the Jews as distinct from others. Any one of those is sufficient to be a member of Edat Yisrael, or Kahal Yisrael, though no particular one was a necessary condition. The second point is that there's a lot of boundary crossing in the Bible. Jews marry non-Jews, or Israelites marry non-Israelites. Sojourners participate in community rights and live within the community for generations. They participate in celebrations, memories, and covenants. They even bring sacrifices to the temple, we find out in the book of Numbers. The fact that there's a lot of boundary crossing does not mean that there is no boundary. Boundary crossing doesn't erase boundaries that create a group's identity. In fact, sometimes they make them more visible. And thirdly, there's a distinction between the identity of the individual and the identity of the community. A community can have a Jewish identity even when that community contains some individuals who are not Jewish and who adopt varying degrees and kinds of affiliation. Some might engage in practices of memory. Some might choose to adopt ritual practices such as circumcision. Some might marry and produce a family. So individual Jewish identity in the Bible is multidimensional, and Jewish communal identity is pluralistic. However, multidimensionality and pluralism are complicated in times of crisis. In times of crisis, people prefer simple, uncomplicated answers. Who is and who isn't a Jew? Who's in and who's out? None of this complicated, messy, half-measures stuff. So I want to talk about two crises that occurred in antiquity that led to attempts to settle on a single, one-dimensional, unambiguous answer to the question of Jewish identity, before we then look at the very different approach of the rabbis of the Talmud. These two responses to crisis proceed in totally opposite ways. One will lead to closing the borders and a radical exclusion. The other will lead to erasing borders and a radical inclusion. The rabbis will negotiate a middle course. The first crisis occurred in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. If those names are unfamiliar to you, we're talking about the 4th century BCE. The Judeans who were exiled at the time of the destruction in 586, the Judeans who were exiled to Babylon, by whose waters they lay down and wept, after the destruction of the temple, have been allowed to return now to Judea to try to reconstruct Jewish life, but they're struggling. They've had a difficult century trying to rebuild their community. When Nehemiah arrives, he sees a community, and his perception is that that community is in crisis. They're losing their language, their culture, their identity. We read about this in text 12 from Nehemiah 13. Also at that time, I saw that Jews had married Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite women. A good number of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and the language of these various peoples and did not know how to speak Judean, Hebrew. I censured them, I cursed them, I flogged them, I tore out their hair and adjured them by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters in marriage to their sons or take any of their daughters for your sons or yourselves." He's quoting that verse back in Deuteronomy 7, which had been said by God in connection with Canaanites. Ezra also feared for the extinction of the community. And we read in text 13 from the book of Ezra. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and they said, "The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians," interestingly, they're permitted, "and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. And in this sacrilege, this desecration of the holy, the hand of the officials and chief men has been foremost." Ezra and Nehemiah saw intermarriage as destroying the community. Now, as we saw earlier, there is no blanket prohibition on intermarriage, on marriage with foreigners in the Torah. Just 3 particular groups for very particular reasons connected with those groups. That's why in Ezra's day, even priests had foreign wives. Ezra's solution to what he saw as a crisis of a loss of identity was to prohibit all intermarriage and all conversion. And he did that by making biological descent, or by trying to make biological descent from 2 Jewish parents the one definition of Jewish identity, by reducing Jewish identity to that one factor of biology. To do this, he creates a new understanding of Israel's kedusha, its holiness. What is kadosh? What is separate and distinct about Israel for Ezra? Not its behaviors or its practices, but its seed, he says. Ezra is among the first to use this phrase, Zerah Kodesh, holy seed, by which he means that Israel is in its essence, in its DNA, genealogically, biologically, separated by God from non-Israelites. Their seed is not holy. And so for him, once you label Israel's DNA or seed as holy, then all intermarriage is impossible, because holy seed and non-holy seed cannot be mixed. It desecrates the holy seed. So Jewish identity, Ezra claims, is a non-negotiable biological fact determined by the possession of 100% Israelite seed, which means birth to 2, not 1, Jewish parents. Nothing can change non-holy seed into holy seed, any more than an apple can be changed into an orange. No ritual of memory, no covenant commitment, nothing. So Ezra orders all Israelites who had taken foreign wives to throw them and their half-breed children out. Now, the problem with a purely biological definition of Jewish identity, like the Ezran holy seed definition, is that it's totalizing. Without 2 Jewish parents, there is simply no way to become a Jew. Jews are born, not made. All election or intention-based forms of membership in the community become impossible, and the community's border is now non-porous. And this idea was a radical innovation. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell us that it ripped the community apart. People came into the street weeping and crying, and in fact he had to basically coerce them by threatening to withhold people's property unless they got rid of their families. And already within the biblical canon, we find a polemic against this understanding of Jewish identity, this holy seed thinking, and a reassertion of the Torah's multidimensional concept. So in 3rd Isaiah, from about this time period, we have a prophecy that says that as sure as a foreigner, do not fear, you shall be admitted right into the heart of the sanctuary. And of course, the book of Ruth, probably written about this time, which tells the story of a Moabite woman. Moabite, one of the 2 groups actually prohibited in Deuteronomy 23, who enters into the community and remains a Moabite to the end. In the last verse, she's introduced by her husband as Ruth ha-Moabiyah, and the tradition still remembers her as Ruth ha-Moabiyah, Ruth the Moabite. So the Ezran holy seed definition of Jewish identity, it took root in some sectarian groups, the sect that lived by the Dead Sea. In the case of Qumran, they adopted this definition of Jewish identity, but it was utterly rejected by the Talmudic rabbis, who have always maintained the possibility of conversion and marriage to a convert. So that's our first crisis. And it's a crisis people reacted to, or Ezra reacted to, by coming up with a single-dimensional definition of Jewish identity, which circled the wagons, closed the borders, and was radically exclusive. The second crisis, I'll be very brief here, occurred in the 1st century, and it prompted a different response by a Jew named Paul. The crisis for Paul was theological, or what's been called the Gentile problem. Paul thought, if Israel's God is the one universal God, well, surely he must have a plan to include the Gentiles in his kingdom, in the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of heaven. And if not through ethnicity, then it must be through something we can all share, a common faith. Text 14 from Galatians. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Notice, it doesn't just say you're all one. You're all one in Christ Jesus. If you have faith, then you're one. So although Paul believed that the differences between Jews and Gentiles would be dissolved only when Jesus returned in the Messianic age, because he believed Jesus was the Messiah, His words were very quickly taken by the church to mean the erasure of all ethnic distinctions, that was a desirable thing in this world even prior to the coming of the Messiah. The early church saw Paul as the champion of a universalism and a universal religion that would erase or overlook all ethnic differences entirely. In fact, the church soon insisted that Jews should give up their particular laws and observances. They should become members of the universal community of faith in the one God, and if not, they were perverse and they were damned. So you have two moments of crisis. They're 500 years apart, and we have two responses that replace the multi-dimensional nature of Jewish identity with a single criterion for identity. Selecting the criterion of biological descent, Ezra tries to make Jewish identity and Jewish community radically exclusive, a separate enclave with a non-porous boundary. Selecting the criterion, the religious criterion of faith in a Savior God, Paul and the early church mostly made membership in the kingdom of God radically inclusive, devaluing particular Jewish identity altogether. Both are offering one-dimensional definitions of Jewish identity, biology or faith. And from the perspective of what would become normative Judaism, they both failed. Two biologically Jewish parents did not become the standard for Jewish identity in normative Judaism, nor did faith in a Messiah that dissolves ethnic particularity. The rabbis who, one could say that Paul succeeded radically in other ways, but I'm saying that from the perspective of normative Judaism, it was a failure. The rabbis will create what will become normative Judaism, and they rejected both of these approaches. I think in a way they just refused to say that there was a crisis. And they forged a middle path between these two extremes. How? Well, unlike Ezra, the rabbis retained the biblical view of identity as multidimensional and not biologically fixed. They maintained a communal border. There's certainly a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew or a goy, and in fact, in some ways, they sharpen it. But they employed a variety of strategies to keep that border porous. We see one of those strategies at work in text 15. Now, this is a story that's recounted in the Mishnah, which is a central rabbinic work from the 3rd century. And in this story, there's an Ammonite who wants to enter the Kahal. Remember, Ammonites and Moabites, Deuteronomy 23, those are the two groups. No. So in this story, you have an Ammonite. He wants to enter the Kahal, which probably is a way of saying I want to intermarry, I want to marry into the community. So we read the text. On that day, an Ammonite ger came and stood before them in the house of study, and he said to them, "May I enter the assembly?" Intermarry, probably. Rabbi Gamliel said to him, "You are forbidden." Rabbi Yoshua said to him, "You are permitted." And now Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua are going to have a little back and forth here to argue this out, okay? So Rabbi Gamliel said to him, Scripture says, Deuteronomy 23, "An Ammonite and a Moabite shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation." It's just prohibited. Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, "But are the Ammonites and Moabites still around? Are they still in their territory? Sennacherib, the king of Syria, has long since come up and mingled up all the nations, as it says in Isaiah, which is, quoting God through Sennacherib, in that I have removed the bounds of the peoples and have robbed their treasures and have brought down the inhabitants as one mighty." And Rabbi Gamliel says to him, "Yes, but there's another verse in Jeremiah 49 that says, 'But afterward I will bring back the captivity of the children of Ammon.'" And that proves that they've been returned. They're an identifiable national group. We know who's a card-carrying Ammonite. He's prohibited. Rabbi Yoshua said to him, "Oh yeah, but there's also a verse that says, 'I will return the captivity of my people Israel and Judah.' And that hasn't happened yet. So I don't know why you think he's returned the Ammonites yet." And so they permitted the man to enter the assembly, to intermarry. It's a great text because in this passage, the ger's marriage is allowed not because the prohibition against marriage with an Ammonite is uprooted, it remains on the books, but because in Rabbi Yoshua's view, we can't apply this prohibition to this particular case with certainty. According to Rabbi Yoshua, national groups have been sufficiently confused by the wars of antiquity, and this is actually true, people have been uprooted and deported and replaced and so on, to cast doubt on the identity of any particular so-called Ammonite or Moabite. And since the identity of this particular individual as a pure-blood Ammonite cannot be determined with certainty, we have two choices. Rabbi Gamliel would err on the side of caution and prohibit this individual, despite his intentions and desires. But Rabbi Yochanan is prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt and use a standard legal presumption, a standard rabbinic strategy, pulls this out of the rabbinic toolbox. It's the strategy of legal presumption. In a case of doubt, you presume that the object or the thing has the status of the majority. You find a piece of meat in the street. If there are 9 kosher butcher shops and 1 non-kosher butcher shop in the street, the legal presumption is it's kosher. Right? The standard principle is used in rabbinic. So he says, look, the majority of foreigners are people we can marry. We don't actually know the status of this person because peoples have been so confused, so we're going to go with the legal presumption that he's one of the majority, the groups of non-Jews that we can marry, and so we permit him. Rabbi Joshua doesn't remove the boundary between Israelite and Ammonite. He doesn't cancel the biblical prohibition of marriage with an Ammonite. But when confronted with an actual person expressing a desire to join the community, he, unlike Rabbi Gamliel, is willing to think creatively about how to make that happen. In this way, he preserves a porous boundary around Jewish identity. A second strategy for maintaining a boundary while allowing boundary crossing was the strategy of legal fiction. We've seen legal presumption, now here's legal fiction. A legal fiction is when you treat a case under the law as if it were something else, so that the existing law can cover that case. We're going to say that a corporation is a person, for example, so now they can make lots of donations to politicians. So legal fictions in rabbinic law are always introduced by a little term, something is or like something else. And so the Babylonian Talmud says quite explicitly, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, a ger shenitga ger, really a resident alien who undergoes conversion, is katan shenolad dame, is like a newborn child. So kit dame tells us it's a legal fiction. He analogizes the convert to a newborn child. That's what makes it possible for the non-native individual to be considered a native-born Jew under the law. We consider them like someone born into the community, and therefore Jewish law applies to them equally. I'm concerned about time, so I wonder if I should skip my third example. Do I have about another 8 minutes or so? Let me skip this one. But this example is simply showing that sometimes through creative biblical interpretation, the rabbis can also solve this problem, the problem of whether a convert who brings the first fruit basket, we talked about before, whether they can say the recitation. Because in fact, God didn't give, can they really say the land that God swore to our fathers to give to us? Remember, Exodus 12 tells us that the ger can speak in that term of the ritual memory and the ritual collective memory and speak about what happened to us. But there's a Mishnah that says, no, they can bring the fruit, but they can't recite because they can't truthfully say that God gave the land to our fathers. But in the second text, 18, in the Jerusalem Talmud, they said, what are you talking about? The text says that Abraham was the father of many nations. Abraham is their father too. They can, of course, bring the first fruit and they can recite with any native-born Jew. These are just some of the ways that the rabbis used legal principles and interpretive tools to forge a middle path between radical exclusivism, like Ezra's, and radical inclusivism, or universalism, like that of the early church. They maintained a clear boundary, differentiating Jew and non-Jew, but they didn't fix that boundary along static lines, static genealogical lines like Ezra. They restored a porous boundary, which allows movement of persons across the boundary. In other words, they made sure that the boundary worked for the community rather than against it. They recognized it's possible to have a strong Jewish community that includes persons with very different ways of affiliating with the community. Indeed, this is important, they recognized that there are different, equally authentic pathways into the community for both native-born and non-native-born. And this will be my last few thoughts and last couple of texts that I'll just refer to make this point. For example, we've already seen that Ruth, who remained a Moabite to the end, Ruth made a courageous existential decision to affiliate herself with her mother-in-law's people, to leave everything that was familiar, to travel to almost certain poverty in a new home and hard work. And she did it because of her great love for a Jewish person, or an Israelite person, Naomi. Ruth's extraordinary courage, her selflessness, her chesed, her deeds of kindness and dedication are praised by the rabbis, One of them says, and this is in text 19, at the very end of that passage, that the scroll of Ruth was written for no other purpose than to teach how great is the reward of those who do deeds of kindness. It doesn't teach us about purity or impurity or prohibitions. It just shows us how great chesed is. A different kind of affiliation is modeled in the biblical text by Jethro. Jethro is the foreign father-in-law of Moses. Exodus 18, and I've just reproduced a few passages from it in text 20, but it contains the story of Jethro's visit to Moses. When he hears of all that God has done for Moses and his daughter Zipporah and for the Israelites, bringing them out of Egypt, he blesses the God of Israel, even though he's a priest in Midian. He blesses the God of Israel. He breaks bread with Moses and Aaron. He then learns that the community is in crisis, and he knows he can help. And so he recommends a workable system of justice, which is all laid out in Exodus 18. And Moses says this isn't a bad idea. He implements his recommendations, and all is well. And at the end of the story, we read that Jethro, full of love for his daughter's new people and admiration for their God, returns to his own country. Jethro's affiliation with the community is grounded in his daughter's marriage to Moses. It's what I call a relational affiliation. He's related to someone in the community, and this grounds his affiliation. Although he lives apart, I'm sure he gets postcards, I'm sure he sends support and birthday greetings, I'm sure he attends the grandkids' life cycle events, and so on. He is a relational affiliate. Ruth and Jethro are both foreigners who affiliate with the community on the basis of a personal bond. They assist the community in different ways at a critical juncture in its history. They ensure its continuation and good functioning, while remaining Ruth the Moabite, who lives with the community, and Jethro the Midianite, who returns to his own people. Different modes. But there's more. The Bible tells us about the descendants of Jethro, and they're an interesting group, the Kenites and the Rechabites. I have given you a little family tree that I put together quickly, so you can see some of their names. But what do we know about some of these characters who descended from this foreign father-in-law of Moses's? Well, on the right-hand side, you'll see that 2 Chronicles 2:55 tells us of a clan of Kenite scribes who dwell with the Israelites in Yavitz, which is a town in Judea near Bethlehem. 2 Kings 10 tells the story of another descendant of Jethro named Yonadav or Yehonadav the Rechabite. He was a zealous worshiper of Israel's God, so zealous that he helped the Israelite king Yehu destroy the Baal cult that was seducing so many Israelites by slaughtering the priests of Baal, such as another descendant of Jethro is mentioned in Nehemiah 13, I think I printed it wrong here. And that's Malchiah, the ruler of a town in Judea who helps to build a portion of the walls of Jerusalem when the Judean exiles have returned from Babylon and are trying to reestablish themselves. He sends help to build the walls. Jeremiah 35, I wish we had a chance to look at that text. You might want to go home and read it. It's a great story that gives us a close look at these Rechabites who descended from Jethro and who have joined the Israelites to live in their land alongside them as nomads. God praises these Gerim, he calls them, these resident aliens living among the Israelites. He praises them as a model people because they obey their ancestral traditions, which dictate a nomadic and teetotaling life. And he says that as a reward for the Rechabites' fidelity to their patriarchal customs, and he says, Israel, I wish you would take a note from their book and follow me the way they followed their ancestors. So he uses them as an object lesson to shame the Israelites. But God says, as a reward for their fidelity to their identity and their patriarchal customs, I promise that Rechabites will stand before God forever and never be cut off. In text 21, we see that the Talmudic rabbis are trying to understand, what does that mean? What does it mean the Rechabites will always stand before God? Standing before God usually means serving in the temple. And so the rabbis interpret God's promise that Rechabites will stand before him forever as meaning that Rechabites, these non-native resident aliens, either sat in the Sanhedrin in the days of the temple, administering and interpreting Torah, or they actually entered the priesthood and officiated as priests in the Jerusalem temple. It's a pretty astonishing text, because priesthood is by lineage. In other words, the rabbis are able to imagine a pluralistic Jewish community that acknowledges and embraces various degrees of affiliation, participation, and identification by native-born and non-native-born. So, in conclusion, what have we seen? We've seen that Israelite identity in biblical and even rabbinic times was multidimensional. There were several sufficient conditions for claiming Israelite or Jewish identity, not just one necessary condition. And the two attempts to make one necessary condition failed from the Jewish perspective. We saw that what makes a community Israelite or Jewish is different from what makes an individual Israelite or Jewish. We saw that boundary crossing doesn't erase boundaries, in fact, it can make them visible. We saw that in times of crisis, it is very tempting to champion one single standard of Jewish identity to the exclusion of all others. We also saw that the Talmudic rabbis resisted this temptation and offered a vision of community that accommodates various modes of affiliation. What are they? Love for an individual Jewish person, like Ruth's love for Naomi, her mother-in-law. A family relationship, like that of Jethro, whose daughter Zipporah marries into the community and whose own grandchildren are fully Israelite. Love of Israel's God, like the zealous Yehonadav and his descendants, who, the rabbis say, may have served as priests. Love of Torah and the traditions of Jewish learning, like the Kenites, who are said to have been scribes in Jabez in Judah, and maybe even sat in the Sanhedrin, according to the rabbis. Philanthropy, a desire to contribute to the physical well-being and protection of the community, like Melchiah, who financed the city walls of Jerusalem. In other words, just as native-born Jews have different ways of realizing their Jewish identity and affiliating with the Jewish community, love, religious commitment, love of learning and tradition, philanthropy, building community, so non-Jews are imagined as participating, affiliating, and identifying in the same varied ways. And this should caution us against establishing hierarchies among community members, as if those drawn zealously to Israel's God are somehow more authentic or committed members of the community than those drawn by love for a Jewish individual. Both are ancient and authentic modes of affiliation. Who is to say that one is better, more authentic, more committed, more courageous than the other? The wings of the Shekhinah are wide and far from leading to dissolution and disaster. The multidimensional dynamism at the heart of Jewish identity, this acceptance of diverse ways to be Jewishly identified or affiliated for both the native-born and the non-native-born, has been an essential tool for the formation, growth, and flourishing of Jewish community across time and across difference. Thanks so much for your attention today.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Hayes. We're going to give the sermons next time. Very relevant, very relevant conversation. I strongly believe that in the future, the Jewish community will not be evaluated by who we were, but by who we failed to include, and to understand that there's more than one way to be Jewish, there's more than one way to be in a relationship with the Jewish community is just fantastic. So thank you for giving us the history so that we can continue to tell this beautiful and relevant story on what other doors we can create to bring people in. So thank you so much. We have some time for questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand, please. Let us know. Yes, Bob.
So, Dr. Hayes, what it sounds like is that there are lots and lots of ways of identifying here as a Jewish person. But in looking at our communities, is there any hope at all for it being this way, this way, this way, and this way?
The question was that what we learned was that there are many different ways to be Jewish, but as we look around at Jewish communities, each of which seems to have a different way of doing things, is there any hope that we'll all agree? That's Jewish identity. That's the whole point, that Kahal Yisrael is this complicated, messy family, some members of whom won't talk to each other, right? Some members of whom won't sit at the same table together, right? But they're going to continue through history.
Relationship status is complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. So, no, I do not think that everyone is necessary. There are still one-dimensioners. There are still one-dimensioners, right? One of the most recent examples of that And again, for historically understandable reasons sometimes, right? I'm not actually saying necessarily that Ezra did the worst thing on earth. I think he saw a real problem. I'm not sure that that had to be the only way to answer it, but I can understand where that instinct came from, and that if our identity means that we have to speak a certain language, then this is a problem, and you're losing the language of the culture. But if you had a different notion of identity, he might have had a different solution that still might have, because in the end, he didn't win, right? The tradition actually rejected his idea and allowed conversion and intermarriage to continue right through 3rd, 2nd, 1st century into the rabbinic period. So he actually was a lone voice, but he gives a whole book in the Bible, so he's kind of a loud voice. But he didn't win. We see it crop up from time to time, very often in the same historical circumstances. So in the 18th century, the Syrian Jewish community, which also was facing a serious crisis, did determine that that conversion is not allowed, that the Israelite identity is biological only, and it is really, and they will never intermarry, and they do not accept converts. So you will always have these enclaves that will pop up, from the Qumran community of the Dead Sea to the Syrian community today. They're also part of the family and part of the story, right? And they're not going to agree, right? Yes.
Oh, yes. I was going to ask you, what about Samaritans that live in Israel today? Would you say they fit one of the 3 models? Because there's a big problem in Israel with that.
There is. So if everyone heard the question asking about Samaritans living in Israel today,
Yes.
I do not pretend to be an expert on the Samaritan community. I will tell you that in rabbinic times, and from the Talmudic perspective, all right, so let's talk just from the Jewish perspective rather than the Samaritan perspective, because I can't claim to know or understand their self-definition. But the rabbis really struggled with them. They didn't know whether the Samaritans were part of Kahal Yisrael. The way they would articulate that would be, are there certain things we can do together with them or not? So you can't do certain things with someone who's deemed to really be outside the community. So in the earlier rabbinic texts, they do allow many things to happen with Samaritans. They do understand them to be basically following God's biblical commandments, and that the main difference is that they're just not following rabbinic law. And so they say, all right, they're still part of the covenant. They still have a place in the community, the covenant community. They don't follow rabbinic laws, so there are certain rabbinic laws and observances we should not do with them. They will not do them correctly according to our view. So they have this kind of interesting hybrid status as being seen as sort of biblical Jews but not really rabbinic Jews. Over time in the Talmudic period, that separation gets a little more stark, and they get a little bit more read out of the community. But there have always been voices that have kind of argued both sides of that coin. So it's complicated. But maybe you know about their own self-definition. What is their... Do you know
Well,
that?
I know for one thing they do not pray to Jerusalem.
Correct. They pray.
And they have this ceremony, it's almost like what Pesach was, where the whole community takes a lamb,
Absolutely.
slaughters it, and the whole community eats the lamb, that one lamb.
Absolutely, at Mount Gerizim. So she's referring to the fact that this community and the bulk of them live on Mount Gerizim. It is true that in Deuteronomy, where God first says that you will establish one holy site, and that will be the only place you're allowed to offer sacrifices, and you'll build a temple and worship me at one holy site. Before Deuteronomy, it could be anywhere. People had holy sites and did sacrifices anywhere in the land. Deuteronomy is this revelation that says it has to be one place. It never names Jerusalem. God just says, you will go to the place where I shall cause my name to dwell. And never names it as Jerusalem. Now, the Samaritans only honor the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And they say that the place where God has caused his name to dwell is Mount Gerizim, which is mentioned in Deuteronomy as one of the places where God appears. So they think they're reading the biblical text correctly, that they are worshiping God at the place at Mount Gerizim, that the temple therefore was never destroyed, and they offer the Passover sacrifice as an actual sacrifice at Passover, and they follow the law of Exodus. So from their point of view, y'all are doing it really wrong. They're the only ones, but that's what I mean when I say the rabbis respected the fact that they seem to feel they're following biblical law, but they're not following the rabbinic interpretation of the tradition, and that's where things got tough in figuring out, are they one community or not?
Growing up, I remember the question being not who is a Jew, but who is a good Jew. I wonder how you relate to this answer given by Polish grandfather, Hungarian father. They seem to be on the same page. Who is a good Jew? Someone who has good Einekach, good Jewish grandchildren. they say, why was Yaakov called Israel? Why not any of the others? Because he knew his grandfather, Abraham, and a relationship with him, and had great relationships with Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandchildren. Chut Mishulash, a three-folded logam hair Yunate. How do you react to that?
So I do think that that's a different question, and I think it's a worthwhile question, because I think all human beings should be talking about what is it to be a good fill-in-the-blank. A good mother, a good teacher, a good computer scientist, a good member of my Jewish community, whatever it is. So I think the value question of what it is to be a good instance of whatever it is an incredibly important question, but I think it's a second-order question. You first have to sort of figure out who's in the room to have the conversation, and once you figure out who's in the room to have the conversation, then I think there really should be an effort to find definitions of the goodness of that thing that embrace everyone, right? That don't leave it. Anyone who's willing to be there and show up deserves a voice at the table. Now, if that voice turns out to be inimical, that's a problem. You have to deal with that. I'm not naive, but to the extent that people actually are coming in a goodwill way, right, or actually have a good faith and good intention, then I think listening to them and their experience and seeing if it's an experience that can fold into the community's understanding of itself is a task that's worthwhile. And then the group that's in the room could think about how do we be the best, kahal, that we as a kahal, now we've decided what our kahal is, what's the best way to be a member of that kahal? To be people who care about continuing the story, which sounds like that's very much a 20th century Jewish definition of what it is to be a good Jew, right? Continuing the story, not letting it be destroyed or annihilated. So continuing the story is really an important part of that generation's notion of what it is to be a good Jew. Is that true with each new generation that comes into the community? I think that will change. Yes?
Now that people can find out what their DNA is, apparently the Kurds are very close to the Jews genetically, and so are some East Africans. How do we deal with this kind of thing? If you're talking about genetically, being a Jew.
Right, so the question is, with genetic testing, people in some ways are becoming more and more obsessed with the idea that identity is wrapped up in our DNA. And I think that's an interesting conversation that our culture is having. I think there are many people who will tell you that when they find out what their DNA is, they're shocked. They don't necessarily feel any sense of identity connection with what that information tells them. There are others that tell them it makes them say, I knew it all along. I always loved, spicy food or Indian or something. So people will find it to explain things about themselves, or they'll see it as completely inexplicable. They don't understand it. So I think that obviously biology and DNA are part of who we are, but they're not the totality of who we are. And I think human experience has shown that again and again and again. Identities and cultures are things that we have to take on and accept and create and perform. Right? They're not just things that are handed to us, signed, sealed, and delivered. We're all always creating ourselves in interesting ways, within certain limitations. I'm never going to create myself as a Chinese person, right? I don't have not just the DNA, I don't have the inkling of the culture, the language, or any of those other things, right? So obviously within certain bounds, but still within those bounds, there is a certain amount of choice. Let's not be crazy, but a certain amount of choice with the identities that we do take on. DNA doesn't quite tell the whole story, but right now there's a big fascination with it.
This week I had a couple from the synagogue that came to my study, and the husband, they both did the ancestry DNA. The husband got 99.9% Ashkenazi Jew, and she, who was, she's just as Jewish as he is, got Italian and Irish, and she was like, maybe I should convert. But that's missing the point that you're bringing to us. It's really not about what type of genetic.
That's accepting Ezra's notion of holy seed definition, which has not been what the standard Jewish definition is. There's a hand here.
Do you think that the Jewish community is now in a time of crisis, and leaders of different factions are becoming either more restrictive or more open?
What a great question. So the question was, do I think that the Jewish community is now in a time of crisis, and that as a result, people are moving to one or the other sort of extreme? Yes, I think that's what's been happening, and I think it's changing, though, for the better. And so maybe those are the kinds of pendulum swings we need. I will tell you that if you look at intermarriage literature through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the narrative is a narrative of crisis. They use this language over and over again, actually into the 2000s as well. That intermarriage is destroying and dissolving the Jewish community. That intermarriage is the reason for assimilation and loss of identity. Never mind the fact that many in-married Jews totally assimilate and give up their Jewish identity. Never mind that. All of the anxiety about Jews assimilating into American culture was put on the backs of intermarried Jews. You're the ones who face pressures of assimilation and loss of identity and individualism going against the community. In-married Jews somehow don't. It's just statistically and factually not true. But intermarriage became the place where Jews talked about the anxieties of being American and trying to sort out what American Jewish community looks like. And are we losing something? Are we dissolving an ancient identity? But again, let's put it on the backs of a certain group. What's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is a number of both quantitative surveys, but also qualitative surveys and studies that have said, we're telling the wrong narrative. We've been telling a narrative of crisis, and it hasn't actually been the crisis people thought it was. We've been told that a Jew plus a non-Jew leads to 0 Jews. That, in fact, statistically, a Jew to a non-Jew, 60% of their children identify as Jewish. So it's actually a net gain. It's not that 1 plus 0 equals 0. It's 1 plus 0 equals 0.6, which means you got 1.6 instead of 1. Right? So just, those quantitative numbers that, 98% of American Jews are proud to be Jewish, even though 60% of Jewish children are growing up in a household with one non-Jewish parent. Right? So rates of intermarriage don't quite map onto this narrative of crisis. This narrative of crisis also didn't stop it. So it doesn't seem to have been a helpful narrative. It just made a lot of people feel really bad. Right? So as a narrative of crisis, intermarriage is causing the dissolution of Jewish identity in America. We have to stop intermarriage or there will be a loss of Jewish identity. In fact, intermarriage has proceeded apace, and 98% of Jews say that they're proud of their Jewish identity. So why? What's going on? Well, in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a lot of grassroots efforts to reach those individuals. Hasn't always been a great job on the part of the denomination's leadership to do that. It's largely emerged from community groups. I was telling Sharon that at Atlanta, the 70% of the synagogue members in Atlanta are non-Jewish. They're the spouses and so on. And they recognized that if they really wanted to sustain Jewish community, they needed to be supportive of these folks and their families. And many of them, they found the non-Jewish partner was actually the one who was determined to have a Jewish home or to raise the children Jewish or give them a strong sense of their identity. That also goes against the narrative we're often told. But it's actually often the non-Jewish partner who brings the Jewish partner back to a sense of their identity and insists on a home. So there are community groups, mothers' circles that help people learn how to run a Jewish home or to keep a kosher kitchen or to celebrate the holidays and other really strong groups. One's called Pathways, I think one's called the Mother's Circle. There are different groups that are supporting this, but it hasn't necessarily come from the leadership. Some of them are still stuck in this narrative of crisis instead of a narrative of opportunity, that actually in some ways there's been a real gain and things change, but change can be scary, but it can be good.
And the studies show that in the case of a couple in which one is a Jew and the other one is a green card holder or a kindred soul, like we call it here, if a rabbi does a ceremony, the likelihood of that positive identification increases significantly.
That's a
which creates the other question: who wins when you say no?
That's right. That's a really important statistic, and I forgot to mention that, but that's very true. That when a couple that is intermarrying, when they approach a rabbi and ask for a ceremony, if the answer is yes, they are much more likely to then continue to have a relationship with the Jewish community, have a Jewish home, raise Jewish children. If the answer is no, that is so off-putting that very often you lose the community altogether. And that's a really interesting statistic. That's a pretty recent statistic from some studies. Yeah.
I tried to keep up.
Yeah.
Where does, it seems the majority of Jewish people still believe that if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish, you don't need to be converted. Where did, that goes back to the DNA thing.
That goes back to
where does that go back to?
Goes back to Roman law.
Yeah, how do we get
Roman law. So in the biblical tradition, descent is patrilineal. Think of all those kings of Israel whose sons sat on the throne, and they had foreign mothers, right? Even Solomon, Bathsheba's probably a Hittite. She's married to Uriah the Hittite, right? So she's probably a Hittite. And we certainly know that Solomon had many foreign wives and so on, and there was not a problem. Patrilineal descent is the norm in the Bible. That switches in the rabbinic period in the Roman era under the influence of Roman law. According to Roman law, descent is passed on through the mother. And so that enters rabbinic halacha in the 2nd, 3rd century that they start to view it. So in the Mishnah already, as long as the mother is Jewish, then they're considered Jewish, they can participate fully. So that switch happens at that time.
Out of influence from someone else?
Sorry?
Out of Roman influence?
Yeah, out of Roman influence. It's a non-native import into the tradition. Kind of interesting.
You've been talking a lot about intermarriage. I wonder, though, what do the texts teach us about people, let's say, who are intermarrying a foreigner, but are trying to practice both Jewish and non-Jewish rituals?
Right. We don't have a lot of texts about that. So the ones that I tend to refer to are the fact that some of the biblical characters who remain the closest continue to maintain their national identities. So I think it's significant, for example, that Ruth continues to be called Hamoavia, the Moabite, and she isn't a convert. As much as she's held up as the model for conversion, she doesn't convert. And there's a really interesting passage in a rabbinic midrash interpretation of the book of Ruth. It's the one that most religious leaders will hold up today as representing the rabbinic view, and I'll tell you in a minute why it isn't. So it's a passage taken out of the midrash on Ruth, where they take that dialogue between Ruth and her mother that I read at the very beginning, where she says, "Don't entreat me, I will stay with you where you go, I will go." And they fill that in to turn it into a full-blown conversion ceremony, where Ruth says to her, "Well, you know that you can't go to circuses and theaters," and she says, "Where you go, I will go." "Well, you have to follow the halacha of purity, whatever I will do." They add language so that Naomi is essentially giving her the conversion scenario and taking her through that. And in fact, they have Ruth even say, "You can try to stop me, Naomi, but you can't, because I am so zealous for God, I will convert," which is not the Ruth I read in the book of Ruth. It's got to do with love of Naomi, but the rabbis turn her into a zealous convert. People hold that up and say, see, the rabbis believed Ruth was converted. Well, they take that text out of context. So if you sit down and read the rabbi's midrash on the book of Ruth, which I've done, the entire thing, that is the only passage in which they turn her into a convert. In the rest, they make the point that she wasn't a convert, that she is Ruth Moabia. And their interpretation of the book of Ruth is entirely a praise to or a consideration of a number of different characters who joined the community without giving up their foreign identity, but who still affiliated and worked for the good of the community and contributed something. And they contrast those with a number of stories of rabbis who do terrible things. It's really an interesting midrash. They go through with all these native-born people, and even they say, David, look, he was pretty bad too. It's really interesting. So they contrast that. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but it's the closest I can come to looking at the classical sources and imagining how people can still be married in or closely connected, intertwined, even have children who have this identity, but still somehow are identified really through their own national or other identity. That's the closest I can get from the sources.
Now, I'll say that one of my highlights in our High Holiday season is when we invite the kindred souls in our community out to the Bima, and we all rise to pay our respects and honor for the support that they do to their families, to their community, to observe Judaism. And everybody says, oh, that's a highlight for me. I'll tell you, the highlight for me is at the same time, but it's different than yours. My highlight is that after we finished that lesson, and I look down, every single person in the synagogue is wiping their own tears. So I want to thank you, Dr. Hayes, for bringing this question into our lives yet again, and to keep us in this track of creating different doors to include, not judging who we are by who we are not, but by being very proud of who we are and very accepting and welcoming the diversity. So thank you so much.
Oh, look.